This lecture covers Eastern Asia. So basically, we're going to look at early China, so the Neolithic and the Bronze Age, and then later Empire China that begins in the Iron Age. So let's begin with thinking about China as a geographical location. So there's two maps here that show you the different regions within China. Ecologically, the western side is pastoral, and this is important because this is where particular groups could exist based on their mode of living. So this is an area where people would herd animals, horses, cattle, things like that. This would also be a place where there is a little bit of tree cover, but less than in an area that might be considered tropical or subtropical. So within China, we also have desert and mountains, some areas of tundra, and forest and tropical jungle, depending on the particular region. So this makes China a pretty varied environment, which means there's a lot of people that could have subsisted in different ways in this particular area. So for our purposes, we're going to start with the Neolithic period. And in the Neolithic, as we already know, this is when people start farming. And by about 6000 BCE, we have early Neolithic Chinese groups farming millet. They do develop rice, but that's a little bit later. As you might note, 6000 BCE is about 2000 years after farming started in the Neolithic region of the Levant, so in that Natufian area. But in the grand scheme of things, 2000 years really isn't that broad of a difference to say that farming pretty much started in most places at around the same time. So something that's unique about Chinese civilization is the fact that the geography is so distinctly different in different regions. And this means that we can have groups that were living in the same sort of geographic area of China, but never need to come in contact with one another. And this is pretty interesting because this allowed Chinese civilization to develop in different places at different times, and it also allowed Chinese civilization to be more secular. So if there's no need to control the environment, then religious ideologies don't need to be applied to such controls like they are in Egypt and Mesopotamia. So within the Yellow River Valley is where we have our earliest Neolithic villages. This map looks a bit confusing, but it's kind of a line drawing of all of the different culture groups that existed at about the same time in the Neolithic period. So the Yellow River Valley is temperate, so it's agreeable to foraging and early agriculture. And there's not really a lot of pre-pottery Neolithic evidence here. So most of the sites we have are technologically advanced enough to make pottery. We don't really have sites that don't have pottery like we do in other regions. So let's start first with thinking about one particular culture, and this is the Dawenku culture, and they date from 4300 to 2600 BCE. This is in the Eastern Valley near the Yellow River. They have a red pottery that's usually recognized because it has a kind of axe-shaped design on it. There is a picture on your screen here, and it's a sort of triangular shape, and this is common on most of their pottery. We do have evidence of rice being grown with millet for agriculture, and we have a lot of evidence of axes. So rice and millet are the main foodstuffs, but there's also some more varied items as well. And we have found in the Dawenku culture a very thin-walled cup, and that's what the picture is here. So these cups are very finely made. They're probably quite fragile, and because of their design, we think that they might have been associated with a ritual feast. And these types of cups are only found in burials. So there's a line drawing of a burial on the left side of this screen. And this is the kind of burial that would have these funerary feasting cups. So we're not sure if this is sort of feasting as a funerary ritual, And so they would feast, and then they would sort of toss the cups in with the deceased, or perhaps these were cups that the deceased used in his own sort of ritual feasting and was buried with them, because they are quite elite, difficult to make, so technologically difficult, so very much associated with a certain level of skill. And usually items in archaeology that are associated with high levels of skill are considered elite or for ritualistic purposes. So feasting has been analyzed in anthropology and archaeology for quite some time, and generally we determine that feasts are a way to form alliances, and they're still actually used in contemporary societies. Some in the Amazon will use feasts to make alliances, to invite their neighbors over and allow them to practice simple exchanges and things like that. So since this is a common occurrence in contemporary populations, it is not a far stretch to think that it might be kind of a norm in antiquity. So I'm prone to think that the Dwenku culture practiced feasting and that they just buried feasting cups with the deceased, and not necessarily that they had a ritual feast as part of the funerary ritual. So it's, you know, another something that's always debated in archaeology. All right, so let's move into a culture as we move more modern in time. And this is the Longshan culture. There's a map on your page here. And this culture dates from 2600 to 1900. So we're now into the Bronze Age. We've moved sort of out of the Neolithic and into the Bronze. So the Longshan culture, the material culture we have for them is jade axes, and that is by far the most prominent material culture we find in this type of culture. And they also have these same thin-walled black vessels that were very similar to what we found for the Dwenku culture. So this suggests that there's some sort of continuity through time, at least in production or even in a ritual feasting or just a feasting in general kind of concept. So we also think, based on the Longshan culture, that perhaps these thin-walled black pottery became even more elite at this time, because they're far less frequent than we found with the Dwenku tombs. So these were probably supposed to represent a more advanced stratification than that existed in the earlier period. So we do have some tombs in the Longshan culture with, you know, very fine artifacts, and then others with, you know, less fine artifacts. So we are pretty certain that there is a distinct hierarchy and a stratification within their culture. We know from settlement data that they had some roundhouses, and also they found infant burials underneath houses. This isn't as strange as it sounds. Burying children or relatives in general underneath a house is quite common. It's a way to make sure your loved ones stay near to you, and it's a way to encourage sort of familial relationships. And so this is pretty typical of the Longshan culture. We also have in some of our graves these perimortem injuries. So these are sort of injuries that probably caused death. So this makes us think that there's some kind of evidence of warfare. Again, there's not a lot of like weaponry, but because of perimortem injuries, that's usually a good sign that there was, you know, a bit of trouble happening in the Longshan culture. So as we moved into the Bronze Age here, our best type site for this is a site called Erlitu, and this dates from 1900 to 1500. This is a pretty large site, and it very clearly has a stratified society. There are two rectangular, what the archaeologists have called palaces, and a lot of smaller houses. So the fact that there is such a differentiation in size shows that there's definitely a stratification here. This site is actually kind of predates a later dynasty that becomes important in the period of empire in China. And so this might be sort of a precursor to the idea of empire in slightly later China.